You're listening to Live Free, Think Free on 90.1 KPFT Houston, your home for uncensored news and underground music since 2011. Let's continue. I remind you that you can find the archives of our show at thehoustonfreethinkers.com. Spotify, just check us out, Live Free, Think Free, and all your usual places. You'll find our podcast, and you can listen to it wherever you go. All right, well, these next couple of stories deal with one of my favorite topics, is digital surveillance. And I say that sort of jokingly, but also I really mean it, because it's such a crucial component of what we're facing and the tyranny that has been rising for years. And you know, I like to pay attention to different developments like this. Whether or not it'll make a difference in the long term, who knows? But this is coming from Biometric Update. It's titled "Restrictions on Police Use of Facial Recognition Have Been Proposed in U.S. Congress." It says there is more legislative action in the U.S. on facial recognition technology, as 4 members of Congress this last week introduced the Facial Recognition Act, which would require police to obtain a warrant and have probable cause to investigate a suspect before conducting face biometric searches. So this is coming from, and this actually does have a local connection, because one of the Congress people was Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, based in Houston, Congressman Ted Lieu of California, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke of New York, Congressman Jimmy Gomez of California, all part of this Facial Recognition Act. And they said, quote, "Protecting the privacy of Americans, especially against the flawed, unregulated, and at times discriminatory technology, is my chief goal with this legislation." So this is also supported by the Electronic Privacy Information Center, EPIC. They are supporting this legislation, and they said that it would prohibit the use of biometrics in the enforcement of immigration laws, on police body cameras, which I think is a great move, during protests, and on live video feeds. Furthermore, it would introduce transparency and reliability requirements to be monitored via public audits, accuracy reviews, and other measures. It was also reported that it would make it mandatory for law enforcement agencies to purge photo databases of kids who've never faced charges or who were acquitted. And Congresswoman Clarke, who's supporting the bill, said, quote, "There's no question that in its current state, facial recognition is a flawed and harmful technology. We have long passed the theoretical point when it comes to its struggle identifying and misidentifying women and people of color, and consequently, the real-world implications of its deficiencies are confronting real people every day. While these shortcomings are disastrous in the private sector and law enforcement, they are entirely unacceptable." So, of course, you know, anybody who's paid attention knows that facial recognition tools have been used, as a repressive tool in places like Australia, China, London, like the most heavily surveyed city, Norway, other places. And there's major concerns, and I've been warning about it for years, and we've been talking about it for years, just how the danger that facial recognition poses, and that there's people much more versed than either of us here on this show, digital rights attorneys and privacy advocates who've been studying this for decades, who are really warning about the world we're moving into of AI, facial recognition, and this next story that I have here, specifically with digital identification. So I'm showing on screen, for those who can see, the U.S. Senate Committee website for the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. And the reason that I'm showing that is because that group, that
Homeland Security, the double dippers,
Homeland Security, that group, which, you know, most of us, again, how many of us are actively watching these committees? Not too many. Well, I decided to go ahead and see what this committee was up to. And what I found is probably something you want to know, because this one actually, the previous one is maybe a step in the right direction, like an introduction of a bill. Doesn't mean it's going to go anywhere, but an introduction of a bill that could actually, limit the use or curtail the use of facial recognition. This one's going kind of the other direction. Last week, U.S. government, under the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, voted to advance the Improving Digital Identity Act. So this bill was introduced last year originally, and it's been kind of just chilling, doing nothing. Well, now they voted it out of committee, and it's now going to actually go to the Senate, where it will be considered as a full bill, and then maybe there'll be amendments and all kinds of stuff, right? Who knows what it's going to end up looking like. But I'm encouraging people to remember and keep your eye on Improving Digital Identity Act. Check that out, because it says here, what I found out was that the bill would establish the Improving Digital Identity Task Force, a public-private task force, which is interesting because we keep hearing about the World Economic Forum promoting this idea of public-private partnerships, a public-private task force to establish a government-wide effort to develop secure methods for governmental agencies to protect the privacy and security of individuals and support reliable, interoperable digital identity verification in public and private sectors. So they always got to pay lip service to protecting our privacy, but I think we, have reasons to be suspicious of that. It goes on to say the legislation would direct the Department of Homeland Security to give grants to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to upgrade systems that provide driver's licenses and other types of identity credentials to support the development of a highly secure, interoperable system that enables digital identity. So basically, DHS is going to give grants to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments around the country to start upgrading all their equipment to accept this new digital identity verification system. And this has got a whole list of politicians' names attached to it if you want to know who not to vote for and all that good stuff. But yeah,
track you.
It's moving in that direction, right? And we got to consider that while this kind of conversation is happening, Micah, there's the one we covered last week with, I think we may have covered it, but if we didn't, I'll just mention it briefly. The Federal Reserve announced that now they're going to do a like a planning exercise scenario for how they're going to do an exercise early next year to determine how they can use their tools at their disposal to fight climate change. So I don't know where that's going to go in the long term, but think about that. Federal Reserve, climate change, digital identity, they're exploring digital dollars, all these things together. I mean, it's not a conspiracy. It's working towards the idea of a carbon credit, a digital wallet where you have a digital currency that has been created through central bank digital currencies, and probably some sort of social credit score type number attached to it based on your purchases, how much meat you're eating, how much you're traveling, all those kind of things. These are all plans being discussed by the Federal Reserve, by various central banks, by the World Economic Forum. But before we get into some more, what do you think about that, Micah? The one step of facial recognition could be potentially a step in the right direction, at least maybe not a worse direction. And then the other one, the Digital Identity Act, kind of just maybe it's just inevitable we're going that direction. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I hate to be the jaded one, but they had to get a warrant to go in and kill the Tuttles. So having to get a warrant, that only means so much. You know what I'm saying? Not trying to be too flip, but I think it's good, so that after they go in and mess somebody up, then somebody like Goins can get fired. Yeah, something like that. I guess that's what I can hope for at best. Is that a little bit too cynical or jaded? I don't know. I mean, we see what happens. But yeah, I think it's noble for them to fight for that, and that's a whole different issue than whether it's effective. It's kind of, maybe it's like Don Quixote, them fighting for it. I don't know. But if we set a standard, maybe people won't accept BS. I don't know. What do the people think? I can't hear you.
I would say that's what you could hope for, right? Is that, maybe by doing this, people do start to wake up, or that people start because again, I think that we should have been having these conversations a few years ago, right? I mean, I'm nobody, extremely, bright, or I don't got a crystal ball, but I have, right here in my possession, a book I wrote in 2019 talking about the dangers of facial recognition, artificial intelligence. And that was just because I was paying attention, as I said earlier, to the lawyers, the digital rights groups. So, and we're in the United States. Again, I'm not always like the person that wants to rush towards government intervention, but there's currently only one state, the state of Illinois in the United States, that has any sort of law that does anything about facial recognition, whether regulate, restrict, ban, whatever. Like that's, so only one state has even had this conversation. Meanwhile, you got companies like Clearview AI and others in the private sector that have been gathering so much data from all of our information we voluntarily put on social media, our face prints, our selfies. And then they taken that and creating databases and then selling that to law enforcement, selling that to, whoever can, afford it. So this conversation is definitely past due, and I don't think it's overly cynical, Micah, because I think it's a past due conversation, but also I don't know. It's just when they put out these ideas of like, oh yeah, they're going to get a warrant now and this and that. It's like, well, weren't they supposed to be getting warrants for all kinds of things they were doing in the past that they weren't getting warrants for? And it is hard to just have any trust in the law enforcement.
When they do get a warrant, does it mean anything? Like in the instance we were speaking of in the Tuttles, like it was based on a confidential informant and anonymous tip. Like I thought that's just absurd.
Yeah, but I do have one actual case, Micah, that I think this is, because in line of the last thought, there was like, I don't have a lot of trust and faith in police in general. I'm not saying I hate every cop or anything like that. I don't, I judge people as individuals. And I'd like to hear from the audience, how you feel about that. Do you think warrants would protect us from facial recognition? First of all, whenever the laws pass and they say, oh, we're going to watch ourselves now, it's going to be independent watchdogs.
Also,
Do you have any trust in that?
like when they make guns illegal, do you think the guns are going to go away? It's the same thing. So facial recognition's illegal. You think people aren't going to be out there gathering faces? Also, it's not the same. Like that question you're asking is one thing, but that's a whole other thing. How are they going to even stop it? I mean, the genie's out of the bag. I mean, it's just out there now.
I agree.
Since 2012, the Conscious Resistance Network has been an independent media organization focused on empowering individuals through education, philosophy, health, and community organizing. We work to create a world where corporate and state power do not rule over the lives of free human beings. Our motto is leading by example and helping others in their pursuit of freedom. Visit theconsciousresistance.com to find our articles, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, books, and more. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.